Burma, February 1945. The jungle is quiet. Too quiet. A thin mist coils between the trees as the night presses in like a living thing. Japanese infantrymen lie flat in shallow trenches, fingers tight around their rifles, eyes searching the darkness for movement. The only sounds are the chirping of insects and the dull rumble of engines somewhere beyond the tree line. Then, without warning, light. A blinding white beam tears through the night like lightning trapped in glass. The jungle explodes in brilliance. Shadows twist violently across the ground. The Japanese soldiers freeze, caught in the open, unable to see, only to feel the glare burning their faces. A tank's silhouette emerges through the smoke and rain, its turret slowly turning. Searchlight blazing from the hull like an unblinking eye. Machine guns open fire, cutting through the panic. Orders dissolve into screams. For the men of Japan's infantry, the darkness had always been their ally. That night, light itself became their enemy. By the final years of the Second World War, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. The Japanese Empire, once dominant across vast stretches of Asia, was now being forced into desperate defense. From New Guinea to Burma, from the Philippines to Okinawa, its soldiers were facing an enemy that had learned, adapted, and grown relentlessly efficient. Yet among the many advantages the Allies gained, one remained invisible until nightfall: control of the darkness itself. For years, Japanese infantry doctrine had relied heavily on night combat. The Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, had perfected infiltration tactics, stealthy movement through jungle, bayonet charges under moonlight, and small unit attacks meant to surprise, overwhelm, and terrify. Night was their element, their shield, and their equalizer against superior Allied firepower. But by 1944, that balance was fading. The Allies had learned the cost of blindness. In the steaming jungles of Burma, American and British Commonwealth forces, including Indian and African divisions, had begun to experiment with new methods to counter Japanese night attacks. Searchlights, flares, and tracer rounds turned night into day, revealing ambushes before they struck. The shift began quietly. Engineers noticed that tank-mounted lamps, originally used for navigation, could be adapted for combat. The idea was simple: flood the battlefield with light so intense that it shattered the advantage of darkness. But simple ideas often change wars. When the first tanks equipped with powerful searchlights rolled into action, they altered the psychology of night fighting. The Japanese, trained to use shadows as cover, suddenly found themselves outlined, every movement exposed. Their night raids, once their greatest strength, became suicide. In the Burma campaign, this transformation became strikingly clear. Allied forces advancing through dense terrain often faced ambushes after dusk. Commanders needed a way to burn through the dark, not just to see, but to disorient. Some British units experimented with tank-mounted searchlights, creating blinding flashes that overwhelmed enemy sight and coordination. Reports from field units describe scenes of chaos. Japanese soldiers caught mid-charge, unable to see or communicate, paralyzed by the sudden blaze. For the Allied crews, it was as if the jungle itself obeyed them. Every tree, trench, and foxhole thrown into sharp, ghostly relief. The concept wasn't entirely new. Earlier in the war, the British had already developed the Canal Defense Light, CDL, a top-secret system built into modified tanks. It projected narrow beams of intense light that could flicker rapidly to confuse the enemy. Although the CDL saw limited deployment in Europe, the underlying principle, weaponizing illumination, found its natural home in the Pacific. Here, visibility meant survival. The Japanese, who often launched night assaults with cries of "Banzai!" and relied on close-quarter shock, suddenly faced opponents who could see them coming. The glare stripped away their element of fear, replacing it with their own. As Allied troops pushed deeper into Japanese-held territory, from the mountains of central Burma to the plains of Luzon, night engagements turned into experiments in light and shadow. Some tank units even synchronized their searchlights with machine gun fire, creating what soldiers called white death zones, where every flicker of movement was instantly targeted. The psychological effect was profound. One Allied after-action report noted, "The enemy appeared stunned. They froze in the open, blinded by our lights." Their counterfire was wild, undirected. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese infantry's greatest weapon, their mastery of the night, was being used against them. And as the Allied advance continued, commanders began to realize something extraordinary. This wasn't just about visibility. It was about control, of space, of fear, and of human perception itself. The idea of using light as a weapon was born not in the jungles of Asia, but in the laboratories and secret workshops of wartime Britain. As early as 1940, British engineers working under the WWII Ministry of Supply had experimented with the Canal Defense Light, CDL, a project so classified that only a handful of senior officers even knew of its existence. The CDL system was ingenious in its simplicity. Built into the modified hulls of Matilda and Grant tanks, these powerful carbon arc lamps projected beams exceeding 12 million candle power. A revolving shutter in front of the lamp could flicker the light up to 6 times per second, creating a strobe effect that disoriented enemy gunners and blinded infantry without giving away a precise target. IT was not meant to destroy. It was meant to dominate perception. In theory, an entire battlefield could be lit in a pulsating, ghostly glow, making defenders lose their sense of depth and movement. But in Europe, the Canal Defense Light saw limited use. The terrain, the pace of war, and the secrecy surrounding the project meant that few commanders trusted it enough to deploy it widely. By late 1944, however, elements of the concept, tank-mounted illumination, coordinated with infantry and artillery, began to find new life elsewhere. In the Pacific and Southeast Asian theaters, conditions were different. The Japanese excelled in ambush warfare, slipping silently through jungle and attacking by night. Against such tactics, conventional visibility tools were nearly useless. The dense canopy swallowed flares, and smoke rendered handheld lamps ineffective. That was where the Allied improvisation began. Engineers and field mechanics, often working under fire, modified standard Sherman and Stuart tanks to carry searchlights salvaged from anti-aircraft batteries or field depots. Some were mounted directly on the turrets, others on improvised brackets along the hull. The light could be focused, tilted, or dispersed, flooding enemy positions in a blinding cone of brilliance. What began as an experiment quickly proved its worth. Reports from the 14th Army under General William Slim, particularly during operations along the Irrawaddy and the approach to Mandalay, describe how searchlights turned otherwise impossible night advances into tactical victories. Soldiers recalled entire ridge lines illuminated as if by dawn, Japanese ambushes collapsing under the sheer shock of exposure. For the first time, light became artillery. Not a projectile, but a psychological barrage that paralyzed men before bullets reached them. The Japanese army was utterly unprepared for it. Their doctrine assumed that Allied forces feared night combat, that Western troops would withdraw or bunker down after sunset. But in 1945, the battlefield reversed. British and American units began launching their own night offensives, using searchlights to sweep through villages, trenches, and forests where the enemy once felt untouchable. Many Japanese diaries and interrogation reports from the period describe this shift in haunting terms. One captured officer admitted, "The light burned into our eyes. We could not see. We did not know where to shoot." Another noted, "The tanks became ghosts. They glowed. Our soldiers thought they were invincible." In the Philippines, U.S. forces advancing through Luzon used similar tactics. Tank-mounted lights, combined with tracer fire and star shells, shattered Japanese defensive lines. For soldiers who had trained for years to move unseen, to fight by stealth and spirit, this new kind of war was unrecognizable. Every flicker of light carried with it something deeper than tactical advantage. It carried fear. Because light, unlike artillery or bombs, touched the mind first. It stripped men of instinct. It forced them to look, even when looking meant death. By the end of the Burma campaign, the Allies had turned light warfare into an art. Engineers refined searchlight mounts, wiring them into tank generators. Commanders coordinated illumination with forward observers, timing beams to coincide with bombardments. Each flash and fade became choreography. Light guiding steel, steel guiding victory. What began as a hidden British experiment had, by 1945, evolved into one of the most unnerving tactical tools of the Pacific War. And for the Japanese infantry, who once owned the night, the realization was devastating. Darkness no longer belonged to them. This section focuses on the human and psychological angle. How the searchlights didn't just change tactics, but invaded the minds of Japanese infantry, turning fear, confusion, and loss of control into weapons more powerful than bullets. War is rarely decided by machines alone. It is decided by what those machines do to the minds of men. When Allied tanks began mounting searchlights in the jungles and rice fields of Asia, the battlefield itself became a theater of illusion. Light, once a symbol of safety and guidance, became a source of dread. For Japanese infantry, the sudden glare of a searchlight in the night was more than a tactical disadvantage. It was a direct assault on their instincts and identity as soldiers. The Imperial Japanese Army had built its night. Doctrine on confidence and psychological dominance. Every recruit was trained to believe that darkness was their ally, a realm where discipline, courage, and will could overcome the enemy's machines. They were taught to move unseen, to kill silently, to trust in the blindness of their foes. But under the white blaze of tank-mounted searchlights, that identity collapsed. The Japanese soldier, crouched, invisible, ready to strike, was stripped bare in an instant. There was no longer mystery in the night, no advantage in stealth, only exposure. Soldiers described the light as burning their souls. One Japanese survivor of the Burma front later wrote, "The light made us feel naked. We could not hide. We wanted to disappear into the earth." The human body reacts to sudden brightness with shock. Pupils contract, the heart rate spikes, and orientation is lost. Multiply that by hundreds of men, in pitch darkness, in combat. And what follows is chaos. Squads broke formation. Communication failed. Rifle fire went wild. Entire platoons froze under the glare, unable to distinguish friend from foe. To the Allies, it looked like precision victory. To the Japanese, it felt like madness. Even those who weren't directly hit by fire suffered a collapse of will. In night battles before the advent of searchlights, Japanese infantrymen often shouted battle cries, "Banzai!" to rattle their opponents and strengthen their own resolve. But when light filled the battlefield, those cries were replaced by silence. The will to charge dissolved before it could begin. It wasn't just about blindness, it was about humiliation. The glare erased the dignity of the warrior, reducing disciplined soldiers to startled prey. For an army built on Bushido ideals of composure and courage, that loss cut deeper than wounds. Psychologists who later studied these encounters noted that light, when used as a weapon, triggers primal terror. Humans are wired to fear exposure. In battle, that fear multiplies. To be seen is to be targeted. To be illuminated is to die. For Japanese soldiers trained to control fear through obedience, the searchlight created an emotional paradox. An enemy they couldn't attack. You could shoot at a tank. You could stab a man. But how do you fight light? Allied troops, observing the results, quickly understood the psychological power they wielded. They began timing the activation of searchlights not just for visibility, but for maximum shock. A tank might sit silent for minutes, engines idling in darkness, before suddenly igniting its beam at the precise moment of an ambush. The explosion of light and gunfire merged into one devastating assault on the senses. In these moments, the battlefield became a study in contrasts. On one side, Allied tankers operated under the controlled hum of machinery, eyes shielded by filters and visors. On the other, Japanese infantry stumbled through blinding radiance, their world dissolved into white chaos. Reports describe men firing into the light, desperate to hit something, anything. Others ran. Some simply dropped their weapons and waited for the beam to move past, as though hoping darkness might return like mercy. Even captured Japanese soldiers later admitted that the lights felt supernatural. In interviews, many compared the glow to the eyes of demons or the wrath of heaven. It wasn't mere superstition. It was the result of a mind stripped of its natural bearings. In one recorded incident during the Battle of Meiktila, March 1945, Allied tanks with mounted lights pushed through a Japanese defensive line after dusk. Witnesses reported that entire squads retreated without orders, abandoning trenches before the tanks even fired. The combination of glare, noise, and dust created an illusion of overwhelming force. A storm of man and machine fused into one. By the war's end, Allied commanders knew what the Japanese infantry had felt long before science could explain it. Light doesn't just reveal, it dominates. It made men question their own senses, their own courage, their own place in the darkness. And when that doubt entered the heart of an army that once thrived on fearlessness, defeat was already underway. In the chaos of night warfare, the difference between victory and annihilation often depended on what could be seen and what could not. By 1944, the Allies had learned that illumination could be as decisive as artillery. The earliest tank-mounted searchlights were crude. Simple flood lamps salvaged from airfields, wired into the tank's electrical system, yet even this basic innovation had an outsized impact. A single lamp could cast a cone of light hundreds of meters long, bright enough to outline a man behind a tree or a rifle barrel glinting in the grass. Soon, these improvised tools evolved into deliberate systems. Engineers on the Burma and Philippine fronts worked around one brutal constraint: power. Standard tank generators could barely sustain the radio, turret motors, and guns. Adding a high-intensity lamp risked draining the entire electrical load. To overcome this, technicians rewired tanks to channel alternating current from auxiliary power units, ensuring the light could burn steady through hours of combat. It was a fragile balance. Too much draw, and the tank could stall. Too little, and the beam would flicker, leaving the crew momentarily blind. But through trial and adaptation, field mechanics found ways to keep the lights alive in battle. Strategically, commanders treated light as a tactical multiplier. Rather than using searchlights continuously, they were switched on and off in short, calculated bursts, synchronized with machine gun tracers, mortar fire, or artillery flares. The effect was disorienting and terrifying. The battlefield seemed to pulse. Darkness, then blinding brilliance, then darkness again. Each flash marked the fall of another position. Some Allied tank platoons operated in pairs, one tank illuminating, the other firing. In reports from the British 14th Army and U.S. 6th Army, crews described using light tanks as forward spotters, exposing enemy foxholes while heavier Shermans followed behind to finish the job. This coordination demanded discipline and timing. Too long a burst of light, and the Japanese could target the source. Too short, and the infantry might lose sight of the enemy. But when done right, it created a rhythm of destruction, a staccato dance of light and lead. The Japanese quickly recognized the threat and tried to counter it. At first, they fired blindly toward the beams, hoping to hit the lamp or its operator. But tank-mounted lamps were small, narrow, and shielded by steel hoods. Their intense glare masked their origin. The very brightness that blinded Japanese riflemen also hid the tank's silhouette. Others attempted to use smoke grenades and burning oil to obscure the field. In some cases, this worked temporarily, but more often, the smoke itself became an amplifier, scattering the light into a glowing haze that made movement even easier to track. Technically, the searchlight was more than illumination, it was information. Each beam gave Allied commanders a new layer of situational awareness. Infantry could move behind the light, protected in the shadows it created. Snipers used the glare as cover, firing from angles the enemy couldn't see through. Artillery observers adjusted fire based on what the light revealed. What began as a simple deterrent became a multi-domain tool, blending visibility, coordination, and psychological warfare. Even the terrain shaped how it worked. In Burma, where humidity thickened the air, light refracted into ghostly beams, making the battlefield look otherworldly. In the Philippines, open fields amplified range and reflection, turning searchlights into blazing spears across the night. For tank crews, the effect was both empowering and eerie. They could see, and yet, in the glowing smoke, everything looked distorted. One British gunner wrote in his diary, "The jungle glowed like a furnace. Every shadow looked alive. We were lighting the world and killing by it." Japanese counter-tactics grew more desperate as the war neared its end. Some units tried creeping assaults through the rear, hoping to destroy tanks from behind with satchel charges. Others camouflaged themselves in reflective mud or water, believing it might scatter the light. None of it worked consistently. By early 1945, the pattern was clear. In any night engagement where Allied tanks used coordinated searchlights, Japanese casualties soared, and their units often broke faster. The technological gap widened into a psychological chasm. The lights didn't just reveal enemies, they revealed the future of mechanized warfare. In the decades that followed, military theorists studying these Pacific engagements noted that the tank searchlights prefigured modern battlefield illumination systems, infrared targeting, and night vision warfare. But in 1945, for the men fighting in the mud, none of that mattered. What they knew, what they felt, was that visibility had become a weapon. A new kind of warfare was dawning, one where control of light and shadow determined who lived through the night. And that shift would come to a brutal, unforgettable climax in the battles that followed. It began with silence, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the jungle whole. No birds, no engines, only the slow drip of rain falling from the canopy. Somewhere in the dark, the men of the Japanese 33rd Division crouched low in their foxholes, eyes straining, fingers tight around their rifles. They were veterans. They had fought the British and Americans across the jungles of Burma and the hills of the Philippines. They knew the smell of danger. But tonight felt different. Tonight, even the night itself seemed to be holding its breath. Then, a low rumble. Distant at first, like thunder beneath the earth. The ground trembled. Branches quivered. The sound grew, deepening into a growl that no storm could make. Tanks. The Japanese had fought tanks before, but always in daylight, when they could see, aim, plan. This was different. This was the black heart of night. The British 14th Army had been planning this operation for weeks. A small valley near Meiktila, Burma, where Japanese forces had dug in to stop the Allied advance. The terrain was perfect for an ambush, but tonight the ambushers would be the hunted. At 2300 hours, a single order echoed over the radio net. Advance. Lights on my mark. Engines roared to life. The column rolled forward. Cromwells and Shermans grinding through mud and mist. Infantry moving behind them in tight formation. Above, the sky was thick with clouds. A moonless void. Every step forward was swallowed by darkness. And then, now, a line of blinding white erupted across the valley. Searchlights. Dozens of them. Each mounted on the turret of a tank, each beam cutting through the black like a blade. The effect was instant, electric, and horrifying. For the Japanese soldiers staring into that light, it was as if the sun itself had fallen upon them. Foxholes turned to furnaces. Every shadow vanished. Men shielded their faces, firing wildly into the glare. But the light only grew stronger. A wall of brilliance crawling toward them, unstoppable. Machine guns opened up behind the beams, their tracers streaking through the mist. Mortars flared in the distance. The jungle came alive. Trees exploding, dirt erupting, shrapnel slicing through the air. In the command tank, Captain Henry Dalton watched through his periscope. He couldn't see faces, only movement, silhouettes scrambling in panic. He keyed his mic. Target the ridgeline. Follow the light! Shells slammed into the hillside, one after another. Each detonation cast the scene into slow motion. Men running, diving, vanishing into clouds of flame. But it wasn't just destruction. It was psychological collapse. The Japanese soldiers had trained to fight unseen, to stalk through darkness, to vanish into the jungle. Now, their greatest weapon, the night, was being turned against them. There was nowhere to hide. Eyewitness accounts tell of soldiers dropping their rifles, covering their faces, screaming as the beams swept across them. A few charged the light, blinded, disoriented, hoping to destroy the tanks with grenades. None made it more than a few meters. One Allied infantryman later wrote, "They didn't run from us. They ran from the light." The battle raged for less than an hour. By midnight, the valley was littered with wreckage. Smoking trenches, shattered guns, the echo of engines idling among the dead. But even after the fighting stopped, the light remained. The tank crews left their beams on for a moment longer, scanning the field, like silent gods surveying the chaos they had made. For the Japanese survivors who stumbled from the jungle days later, the memory burned deeper than any wound. They spoke of white fire, of the eyes of steel beasts, of a light that turned night into death. And across the Allied lines, commanders took note. The experiment had worked, better than anyone had imagined. Reports described enemy paralysis, instant collapse, total disorientation. The psychological toll was undeniable. That night marked the beginning of a new doctrine: illumination warfare. Soon, searchlight-equipped tanks became standard in night patrols and assaults. Some were modified to project diffused light for cover. Others were paired with flares, creating layered zones of visibility. For the rest of the Pacific campaign, the Japanese would never again feel safe after sunset. The jungle, once their ally, had betrayed them. Every rustle, every flicker of light carried the memory of that burning valley. And for those who fought there, both sides, the night was never the same again. When dawn finally came, it revealed a landscape few could comprehend. The valley that had been shrouded in darkness for centuries now lay silent, filled with twisted metal, overturned helmets, and the faint haze of cordite drifting through the air. The jungle, always so alive, had been torn apart, trees scorched, roots blackened, the ground scarred with tank tracks and craters. For the Allied troops, it was a victory, but not a triumph they celebrated. Men walked among the wreckage quietly, stepping over shattered rifles and empty magazines. Some stared at the tanks, their searchlights now dim and lifeless. and realized they had witnessed something entirely new. Not just a battle won, a concept born. Reports from that night traveled fast. Commanders at field headquarters near Mandalay read the dispatches with disbelief. The use of searchlights on tanks was meant as a small tactical experiment, a test in controlled illumination for night navigation. Instead, it had become a psychological weapon of devastating effect. Within weeks, the British 14th Army and its American counterparts began compiling after-action reports. Engineers analyzed how the beams had cut through mist, how glare affected the enemy's aim, and how the tanks coordinated fire under their own light. What they found was startling. The blinding illumination did more than reveal targets. It broke morale. Captured Japanese diaries later confirmed it. One soldier wrote, "We could not look. The light burned our eyes. The ground disappeared beneath it. We could not see our comrades, only light and fire." Another note found on a fallen officer's map read simply, "It is not a war of men now. It is a war of light." The phrase spread through the Allied ranks as a kind of legend. The War of Light. It became the unofficial name of that night among soldiers who were there. Commanders recognized that this wasn't just about technology. It was about psychology, perception, and control of fear. By seizing light, the Allies had seized the one thing the Japanese infantry depended on most: darkness itself. In London, reports from Burma reached the War Office. Military engineers at the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers (IREME) division began studying the concept for broader applications. Could light be weaponized not to kill, but to confuse, freeze, and expose? By mid-1945, the British had begun experimenting with artificial moonlight. Powerful searchlights bounced off clouds to create soft, diffused light across the battlefield. The goal was simple: illuminate friendly troops without revealing their source. The first major use came in Europe during the Rhine crossing, where beams from searchlights hidden behind hills turned night into a pale silver glow, guiding tanks and infantry safely across. What had begun as an improvised tactic in Burma evolved into a new branch of military thinking: illumination warfare. The Japanese command, on the other hand, was slow to adapt. By 1945, their logistics were collapsing. Fuel shortages, disrupted supply lines, and the loss of air superiority left little room for innovation. But in post-war interviews, surviving Japanese officers recalled that the night of the searchlights had deeply shaken morale. It proved that even the safest hour, night, could no longer guarantee survival. The terror of light had done what bullets could not. It dismantled the mental framework of a warrior culture built on control of darkness and surprise. For the Allies, this realization carried into the Cold War. Illumination and psychological dominance became critical components of strategy. From Vietnam's flare-lit jungles to modern urban night operations, the lesson remained the same. Light was power. Light was fear. And whoever controlled the night controlled the war. The war moved on, as wars always do. But for those who had seen that blinding valley in Burma, the memory never faded. In military schools across Britain and the United States, the lesson was quietly studied. Not as a story of victory, but as a case study in how light could break the human mind. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, engineers turned their attention to the question that lingered. How could armies dominate the darkness without surrendering to it? The searchlight experiment had revealed two truths: that visibility could be weaponized, and that fear was just another battlefield. Those truths became the foundation of modern night warfare. By 1946, laboratories in Britain's Ministry of Supply and America's Aberdeen Proving Ground were experimenting with infrared illumination, invisible beams of light detected only by electronic scopes. It was the logical next step. If visible light could terrify, then invisible light could control. The first crude sniper scopes and snooper scopes appeared by the end of the decade. Heavy, battery-powered devices that allowed soldiers to see through total darkness. Their lineage traced directly back to Burma. To the moment commanders realized the tactical power of manipulating vision itself. Searchlights, once mounted on tanks, were redesigned for versatility. Some were fitted on jeeps and armored cars for quick deployment. Others were adapted for airfields and naval use, guiding night landings and protecting convoys from torpedo attacks. Even in the ruins of post-war Japan, captured Allied films of the night-light battles were quietly studied by the newly formed self-defense forces in the 1950s. Though humbled, Japanese tacticians took notes, recognizing that mastery of perception, not just firepower, defined the next generation of war. By the time the Korean War erupted in 1950, illumination warfare had evolved again. Searchlights gave way to flare ships, aircraft orbiting above battlefields, dropping magnesium flares that turned night into day. Ground troops advanced under a false moon, the sky lit white as paper, every shadow a potential target. The logic of fear through light continued, but with precision and intent. In the jungles of Vietnam 2 decades later, the same philosophy returned in a new form. Helicopters equipped with massive xenon lamps swept villages, tunnels, and tree lines. Searchlight vehicles patrolled roads at night. And on the other end of the spectrum, night vision goggles, the invisible heirs of the WWII. Burma experiment gave American troops the godlike ability to see what others could not, a single thread connected it all. The moment when tanks in Burma had first used light not to guide themselves, but to blind the enemy. What had been a desperate improvisation had evolved into a doctrine. Control the senses, and you control the fight. By the late 20th century, even psychological operations borrowed from that principle. Blinding strobes, loudspeakers, searchlights, and sudden illumination were used not just in combat, but in crowd control, hostage rescues, and urban warfare. The battlefield had shifted, but the lesson remained unchanged. Light shapes fear, and fear shapes behavior. For historians, that night near Megtila became a strange but pivotal chapter. It showed that technological dominance is not only about weapons, it's about what the human eye and mind can endure. It revealed that the smallest tactical innovation, a light bolted to a tank, could ripple through decades of military evolution. Even today, in the age of thermal cameras and satellite imaging, the idea endures. Armies still train to fight under the light, whether it's artificial illumination or digital vision. Night is no longer the refuge of the hidden. It's another domain to conquer. And in that conquest, somewhere deep within the archives of war, remains the echo of that first experiment, the night when Allied tanks turned on their lights. And the darkness blinked. War teaches strange lessons. Some are written in blood, others in silence, and a few in light. The night the tanks used searchlights in Burma was not remembered for its scale or its casualties. It was remembered for what it revealed about human nature. That fear is not born in the dark. It is born in the unknown, and that when man learns to master light, he does not just change the battlefield. He changes what it means to see. For the Japanese soldiers who faced that blinding assault, it was more than defeat. It was disorientation of the soul. In an instant, their world, built on shadows and stealth, vanished. The darkness that had always protected them turned against them. For the Allies, it was a glimpse into a new dimension of warfare, where perception itself became a weapon, and where technology could reach not only the body but the mind. The battle's memory lived on not in headlines, but in the quiet evolution of every future conflict. From the glow of flares over Korea to the green haze of night vision in Vietnam, from the beam of a searchlight cutting through dust in Iraq to the invisible sensors of modern drones. Every soldier who fights in the dark inherits that legacy. What began as a desperate experiment in a jungle valley became a permanent scar on the history of war. It taught commanders that light is not only to see, but to shape what is seen. And it reminded the world that progress often begins in the most unlikely of places. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in fear, sometimes in the blinding flash of a single, unforgettable night. The jungle has long since reclaimed that valley. The trees have grown back, but if you stand there at dusk and the mist begins to rise, some say the air still holds a faint, ghostly shimmer, a reminder of the night when darkness died.